The ceiling fan hummed softly, stirring the warm air in the dimly lit sitting room. Mrs. Jacinta sat on her couch, her tired body sinking into the cushions as she reached for the glass of water on the small wooden table. It had been a long day, but at least it had been a good one. Beside her, a black handbag rested on the couch, slightly open, revealing bundles of crisp Naira notes. She had waited years to gather this money. It was meant for something important: a piece of land, her future security. A smile touched her lips as she thought of the dreams she had carefully built around that money. Soon she would start building a house, a place she could call hers, a place where her only son, Joshua, would have a better future. A weary smile tugged at her lips. Joshua, her pride and joy, her prayers answered. Though he had grown distant lately, she believed it was a phase. He was young, and young men often got carried away, but, deep down, she had faith that he would come back to his senses. At times she blamed herself for pampering him too much. Only if she had listened to advice, Joshua wouldn't have turned bad like he did. Outside, the night was calm. The distant barking of dogs echoed in the background, blending with the rhythmic chirping of crickets. The house was quiet, peaceful. Then suddenly, bang! The front door swung open so forcefully that it crashed against the wall, sending a sharp gust of wind rushing into the room. Mrs. Jacinta gasped, nearly dropping the glass in her hand. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she turned toward the entrance, her mind scrambling to understand what was happening. Two figures stormed inside. Her first instinct was to scream, but then she recognized him. Joshua, her son. The relief that flooded her chest was brief because the look on his face sent a chill racing down her spine. His eyes were dark, unreadable, filled with something she couldn't name. Beside him stood another young man, someone unfamiliar, a friend of his perhaps, a bad influence no doubt. Joshua, she called, her voice uncertain. What is going on? He didn't answer. Instead, he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. Her breath hitched. Something about his posture, his silence, made fear creep into her bones. Joshua, what is this? She asked again, forcing a nervous chuckle. Why are you looking at me like that? Still, he said nothing. The other boy exchanged a glance with him, a silent conversation passing between them. Then Joshua spoke. Where is the money? Mrs. Jacinta froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. What? The money you brought home today, Joshua said again, his tone sharper this time. Where is it? Her stomach twisted. She stared at him, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke, a cruel, tasteless joke. But there was no humor in his eyes, only cold determination. A lump formed in her throat. Joshua, you mean? She didn't get to finish. A hand struck her cheek with such force that her head snapped to the side. Pain blossomed across her face, hot and stinging. She gasped, staggering backward, one hand flying to her burning skin. Her own son had just hit her. For a few seconds, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind struggled to catch up, to make sense of what had just happened. Joshua, she whispered, her voice shaking. A low, mocking laugh came from the other boy, Joshua's friend. Then, a hard shove. Mrs. Jacinta stumbled, her legs giving way beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor. Her handbag tipped over, spilling some of the neatly stacked money onto the tiles. She barely had time to react before another blow, and another. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She lifted trembling hands, trying to shield herself, trying to plead. But the voices around her grew distant. The world tilted. The room darkened. The last thing she saw was Joshua, standing over her. Her lips parted, a faint whisper escaping. Joshua, my son. Then, silence. And the house fell still. The house was eerily quiet. Joshua stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. His hands, trembling and clammy, were still clenched into fists. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear anything else. His friend, Kelvin, was the first to move. He nudged Mrs. Jacinta's still body with his foot. She's not moving, Kelvin muttered, his voice lower than usual. Joshua swallowed hard. His throat was dry, as if he had swallowed sand. He wanted to say something, but his voice refused to come out. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, suffocating him. Kelvin squatted beside the motionless body and pressed two fingers to her neck. He stayed like that for a few seconds, then exhaled and stood up. She is gone, he said simply. Joshua felt his knees go weak. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He had told himself that they would take the money, that they would scare her if necessary. But this, his mother, His own mother. A sickening feeling crawled into his stomach, making him feel like he would throw up. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see her lying there, so still, so silent. Just minutes ago, she had been sitting on that couch, drinking water, relaxed, thinking she was safe in her own home. And now, Kelvin bent down and started gathering the scattered money from the floor, stuffing it into a plastic bag he had brought. Joshua barely noticed. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred. Kelvin nudged him. "Help me carry the money." Joshua didn't move. "Joshua," he flinched. "Snap out of it, man, we need to get out of here." Joshua turned his head slowly, looking at Kelvin as if seeing him for the first time. The reality of what they had just done was beginning to settle in, and with it came a deep, unbearable weight in his chest. Joshua's voice cracked. "We shouldn't have done this." Kelvin scoffed. "Are you serious right now? We did what we had to do. This is what we had been doing, or is it because she is your mother? We needed the money. We got it. End of story." Joshua shook his head violently, his breath coming in short gasps. "But this is my mother." Kelvin sighed impatiently and grabbed Joshua's wrist, shaking him roughly. "What if my own mother listened to me? There's no going back. What's done is done. We take the money, we leave, and we never speak of this again." Joshua's hands felt cold, his body light, as though he was floating outside himself, watching all of this happen to someone else. His eyes drifted back to his mother. Her face was turned slightly to the side, her lips parted, as if she had tried to say something in those last moments. The warmth had already begun to fade from her skin. A shudder ran through him. Something about the way she lay there made him feel as though she could still hear him. As though she was still present, watching, listening. For a split second, he thought he saw her fingers twitch. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked. Nothing. Kelvin slung the bag of money over his shoulder and headed toward the door. "Come on." Joshua hesitated, his feet refusing to move. This was his home. This was the place where he had grown up, where his mother had cooked for him, cared for him, and stayed up at night when he was sick. And now, it would never be the same again. With a final, shaky breath, he turned away from the lifeless figure on the floor and followed Kelvin into the night. The night air was thick and suffocating as Joshua walked away from the house he had called home all his life. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his actions were dragging him down. Kelvin was a few steps ahead, walking with ease, as if nothing had happened. As if they had simply run an errand and were now returning home. Joshua, on the other hand, felt like he was carrying an invisible burden, one that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. They walked in silence for a long time, until they reached Kelvin's one-room apartment in a rundown part of town. The walls were cracked, the air smelled of dampness, and the single window was covered with a tattered curtain. Kelvin tossed the bag of money onto the bed and stretched his arms. "We did good, man. This is enough to set us up nicely." Joshua remained by the door, his hands clenched into fists. Kelvin noticed. "What now?" Joshua's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he turned and stepped outside. The night was unusually still. Joshua inhaled deeply, hoping to steady his racing heart. The neighbors had called him. They told him that his mother was dead. And he had gone to the house and cried like he didn't know what happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A strange chill crawled over his skin. Then, a whisper, soft, barely audible. "Joshua." He spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. The street was empty. His breath came out in shaky puffs. He was imagining things. He had to be. But just as he turned to go back inside, he heard it again. "Joshua." This time, it was closer. His blood ran cold. And then, as if carried by the wind, he smelled something familiar, his mother's perfume. Joshua's body stiffened. His eyes darted around the deserted street, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the soft whisper of the wind, rustling through the trees. Yet the scent of his mother's perfume clung to the air, familiar, unmistakable. The same fragrance she always wore, subtle jasmine with a hint of vanilla. It was the scent that used to bring him comfort when she hugged him as a child. Now, it made his blood turn to ice. His breath came out in short, uneven gasps. His fingers twitched at his sides. His mind screamed for him to run, to get back inside, to pretend he hadn't heard anything. But then, a soft knock echoed from behind him. Slow, measured. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned sharply toward the sound. Nothing. There was no one at the door. No one on the street. Yet, the scent of her perfume grew stronger. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His throat was dry. He forced himself to swallow, but it felt like sandpaper scraping against his insides. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Joshua! The whisper came again, this time, right next to his ear. He jumped back, his hands shooting up in defense. His eyes darted around wildly, but there was nothing, no one. Kelvin's door creaked open behind him. What are you doing out here? Joshua spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance. Kelvin stood in the doorway, looking at him with narrowed eyes. You okay, man? Kelvin asked. You look like you just saw a ghost. Joshua swallowed hard. His tongue felt like lead in his mouth. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Did you hear that? Kelvin raised an eyebrow. Hear what? Joshua hesitated. He didn't want to sound crazy. Nothing, he muttered, shaking his head. Forget it. Kelvin scoffed and stepped aside. Well, get inside before someone sees you acting weird. Joshua hesitated for another second, his eyes lingering on the empty street. Then, with a final shudder, he turned and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Joshua barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face. The way she had looked at him before the light faded from her eyes. The shock, the disbelief, the betrayal. He turned over in bed, squeezing his eyes shut, but no matter how hard he tried, sleep wouldn't come. He could still hear the whisper of her voice in his ears, still smell her perfume in the air. His body was tense, his muscles coiled tight, as if expecting something or someone to appear in the darkness. Then, a light tap on the window. Joshua's eyes snapped open. He held his breath. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. Kelvin stirred beside him but didn't wake up. Joshua's hands gripped the blanket tightly. His heart pounded. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but through the thin fabric, he could see the outline of a shadow. A tall, unmoving figure, watching, waiting. Joshua's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the blanket. He wanted to move, to get up, to wake Kelvin, to do something, but he was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Then, the whisper came again. Joshua! A ragged gasp escaped his lips. His body jerked upright, his hands trembling. He reached for Kelvin, shaking him roughly. Kelvin, his voice was hoarse with fear. Kelvin groaned and turned over. What? He mumbled. There's someone outside, Joshua whispered frantically. Kelvin groaned louder this time, rubbing his eyes. Bro, you're losing it. I'm serious, Kelvin, Joshua hissed. Check the window. Kelvin sighed and sat up. Fine. He swung his legs off the bed, stretched, and walked lazily to the window. With an exaggerated yawn, he yanked the curtain open. Nothing. The street outside was empty. No shadow, no figure. Kelvin turned back to Joshua, looking irritated. See, nothing's there. Joshua's chest rose and fell rapidly. But I saw. You saw nothing. Kelvin cut him off. Your mind is playing tricks on you. You just need some sleep. Dead people have no power. Joshua wasn't convinced. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had heard. And worse, he knew who it had been. His mother. Kelvin sighed and crawled back into bed. Just sleep, bro. You're overthinking things. Joshua swallowed hard, but nodded. He lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. His body was still tense, his hands still trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut, tried to ignore the fear gnawing at his insides, tried to convince himself that Kelvin was right, tried to believe that it had all been in his head. But deep down, he knew the truth. She wasn't gone. The next morning, Joshua awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. For a moment, he lay there, chest rising and falling, staring at the ceiling. His mind felt heavy, like he had been running all night in a dream he couldn't escape. Then he remembered. The shadow, the whisper, the scent of jasmine. His body tensed. Kelvin was still asleep beside him, snoring softly. Outside, the early morning sun had begun to creep in through the cracks in the curtain. Joshua hesitated before getting out of bed. His feet touched the cold floor, sending a small shiver up his spine. He glanced toward the window, the same window where he had seen her last night. Nothing. He let out a breath. Maybe Kelvin was right. Maybe he was just imagining things. He pushed himself up and walked toward the small bathroom, rubbing his face. His body felt weak, his limbs sluggish. Inside, he turned on the tap and splashed cold water over his face. The sharp chill jolted him awake, washing away the last remnants of sleep. He exhaled slowly, gripping the sink. Then he looked up at the mirror, and froze. His reflection was normal except for one thing. There was someone standing behind him. Joshua's breath caught in his throat. The figure was faint, almost transparent, but he could see it clearly. A woman. Her hair falling over her shoulders, her dress long and flowing, her eyes dark pools of emptiness. His mother, his dead mother. Joshua whirled around. The bathroom was empty, but when he turned back to the mirror, she was still there, staring, watching, waiting. Joshua stumbled backward, hitting the wall. His heart pounded so loudly it echoed in his ears. His legs trembled, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The reflection of his mother tilted her head slowly, her lips curling into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. Then, in a low voice, she spoke. "Joshua, did you think you could get away?" A strangled cry escaped his lips. He bolted out of the bathroom, nearly knocking over the chair in the room. Kelvin jolted awake. "What the hell, man?" Joshua didn't answer. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling erratically. Kelvin squinted at him. "You okay?" Joshua's lips trembled. He opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. I need air." He rushed out before Kelvin could question him further. Joshua sat on the front steps of their small apartment, his hands gripping his knees. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, warming the earth. Yet Joshua felt nothing but cold. His mind was racing. Was he losing it? Was his guilt eating him alive? Or was it real? Was his mother really back? He buried his face in his hands. Why won't she leave me alone? It had been 3 years. 3 years since that night. 3 years since he had struck her, since he had watched her crumble to the floor. 3 years since he and Kelvin had stolen the money she had worked so hard for and left her lifeless body behind. At first, it had been easy to ignore the guilt. They had moved to another town, changed their lives, and acted like nothing had happened. The money had been good, better than anything they had ever had. But peace had never come. And now he was sure she was here, watching, waiting, punishing. He heard footsteps behind him. Kelvin sat down next to him, yawning. "Bro, seriously, what's going on with you?" Joshua didn't answer. He just shook his head. Kelvin nudged him. "Talk to me, man." Joshua swallowed. "She's here." Kelvin frowned. "Who?" Joshua turned to face him, eyes wild. "My mother." Kelvin stared at him, unblinking. Then, he let out a sharp laugh. "Man, don't start this nonsense." Joshua didn't blink. I saw her. Kelvin." Kelvin sighed heavily. "Listen, we've been over this, Joshua. It's all in your head. You feel guilty, I get it. I feel guilty too sometimes. But ghosts, spirits, come on, bro. We both know she's gone." Joshua shook his head violently. No, Kelvin. She's not gone. She's here. She's watching me. She is not like your mother. My mother is stubborn. Her ghost is also stubborn. He stopped. Kelvin raised an eyebrow. "She's what?" Joshua's hands trembled. His voice dropped to a whisper. "She spoke to me." Kelvin stiffened. Joshua looked at him desperately. "I saw her in the mirror. She was standing behind me. And then she whispered, she said, 'Did you think you could get away?'" Kelvin rubbed a hand down his face. "Man, you need to stop thinking about this. It's messing with your head. You didn't see anything. You're just paranoid." Joshua shook his head. "I know what I saw." Kelvin exhaled loudly. "You need to let this go. It's been years, Joshua. We can't change the past." Joshua's jaw clenched. His fists tightened on his knees. But what if the past wasn't done with them? What if his mother wasn't going to let it go? Joshua didn't go back inside for a long time. Even when the sun set and the street lights flickered on, he stayed outside, staring into the darkness. He was afraid. Afraid of what waited for him inside. Afraid of the whispers. Afraid of the mirror. Afraid of the shadow that stood just beyond the light, watching, waiting, and promising that this was only the beginning. Joshua didn't sleep at night. He tried, he really did. He shut his eyes, turned on his side, covered himself with the blanket, and forced his breathing to slow. But the moment he started to drift off, something pulled him back. A sound, a whisper. "Joshua." His eyes snapped open. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtain. Kelvin was sound asleep, his deep breathing steady and undisturbed. Joshua's heart pounded. Had he imagined it? No, he had heard it. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. Nothing. The chair was empty. The wardrobe stood still. The window was closed, but the air felt heavy, thick, like someone was there, watching, waiting. Joshua swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up. He reached for the bottle of water beside his bed, his hands unsteady. Then, tap, his breath hitched. The sound had come from the window. Tap, Tap. A chill ran down his spine. He turned his head slowly, dread coiling in his stomach. Outside the window, the darkness pressed against the glass, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A faint outline, a face, her face. Joshua's blood ran cold. His mother was standing outside the window. Her eyes were dark hollows, her lips unmoving. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She just stood there, staring at him. Joshua's body locked in place. He wanted to move. He wanted to scream, but fear gripped his throat, holding him still. Then, she smiled. A slow, eerie, knowing smile. Joshua's breath came in ragged gasps. Then, in a voice as soft as the wind, she whispered, "I see you." Joshua lurched backward, knocking over the water bottle. His movements woke Kelvin, who groaned and sat up. "Bro, what the hell?" Kelvin stopped when he saw Joshua's face. Joshua was shaking violently, his skin pale, his eyes wild. He was pointing at the window, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to speak but couldn't. Kelvin followed his gaze. There was nothing there. The window was empty. Kelvin sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Joshua, man, you're losing it." Joshua didn't respond. His chest was rising and falling erratically. His body refused to stop trembling. Kelvin grabbed his arm. "Look at me." Joshua didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the window, as if expecting someone to reappear. Kelvin shook him hard. Snap out of it. Joshua finally turned to him, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I saw her," he choked out. "I saw her." Kelvin's jaw clenched. "You're dreaming, bro. You're just tired. You need sleep." Joshua shook his head furiously. No, she was here. She was right there. She was looking at me. She whispered, she said, "I see you." Kelvin groaned. "This is getting out of hand." He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Look, maybe you need to see someone. A pastor, a psychologist, I don't care. But this isn't normal." Joshua's breathing remained shallow. His fingers dug into the bedsheet. Kelvin sighed. "I'll leave the light on, okay? You need to sleep." Joshua didn't reply. He just stared at the window, waiting. But the face didn't return. Not that night. Joshua didn't step outside the next day. Something about the air felt different, charged. It was like the world had shifted, like he had crossed an invisible boundary he wasn't supposed to cross. He barely ate. He barely spoke. Kelvin tried to distract him, put on the TV, cracked jokes, even offered to take him out. But Joshua remained withdrawn, his mind trapped in a loop of fear and uncertainty. Kelvin sighed, rubbing his temple. "Man, if you keep acting like this, you're going to lose it for real." Joshua looked up, his eyes dull. "I think I already have." Kelvin clicked his tongue. "Bro, we've done bad things, yeah. We've made mistakes. But the dead don't come back. Joshua, you need to let this go before it destroys you." Joshua exhaled shakily. "But what if it's real?" Kelvin leaned back against the couch. "Then what? You want to go back and fix the past? You want to apologize to a ghost?" Joshua flinched. The words stung. Kelvin shook his head. "Look, I'm done talking about this. Either you move on, or you let it kill you." With that, he stood up and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Joshua remained seated, staring at the floor. The words echoed in his head. "You let it kill you." Maybe that was the only way, because deep down, he knew the truth. His mother wasn't done with him, and she wasn't going to stop. Not until he paid. She was so stubborn. That night, Joshua sat on his bed, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Kelvin had gone out, leaving him alone. The silence was deafening. Joshua stared at the mirror across the room. He hated mirrors now, because every time he looked, he expected to see her standing behind him. He exhaled shakily and closed his eyes. "Joshua." His eyes flew open. The voice was inside the room, behind him. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head, and the light went out. A breath of cold air brushed against his neck. Then, a hand touched his shoulder. Joshua screamed. Joshua bolted from the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, pressing himself against the wall. The room was dark to dark. He fumbled for his phone, his shaking fingers struggling to switch on the flashlight. The moment the beam of light cut through the shadows, his eyes darted across the room. Nothing. The chair, the wardrobe, the desk, empty. But he had felt it. The hand, the breath, the presence. His body trembled violently. His knees threatened to give way. "It's in my head. It's in my head." He forced himself to breathe. In, out, slow, steady. Then, creak. The sound came from the corner of the room. Joshua's flashlight jerked toward the source. The wardrobe. The door was slightly open, a small gap, a darkness deeper than the night itself. Joshua's throat tightened. She's here. He took a slow step forward. His legs felt like lead, but something an unseen force pulled him toward the wardrobe. He reached out. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open wider. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second he saw her. Mrs. Jacinta, crouched inside the wardrobe, her hollow eyes staring up at him, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Then, the light died. A scream tore from Joshua's throat as a freezing grip closed around his wrist. Kelvin found Joshua huddled in the corner of the room when he returned. The lights were on. The wardrobe was closed. But Joshua was not the same. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, staring at nothing. Kelvin rushed to him. Joshua, what happened? Joshua didn't respond. Kelvin grabbed his shoulders and shook him. Hey, what's wrong with you? Joshua finally blinked. His lips parted. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She touched me. Kelvin's stomach tightened. Who? Joshua swallowed hard. Then, in a voice filled with pure terror, he rasped, my mother. Kelvin released him instantly and staggered back, his pulse spiking. Joshua's hands were shaking violently. His shirt was drenched in sweat. Kelvin forced himself to remain calm. He took a deep breath. Listen, man, you need help. Joshua's laugh was hollow. Help. He lifted his head slowly, his dark-rimmed eyes locking onto Kelvin's. There's no help for me, Kelvin. She's here. She's not leaving. Kelvin ran a hand down his face, trying to suppress the chill crawling up his spine. This is guilt, Joshua. We did something terrible. And now your mind is playing tricks on you. Joshua shook his head, his breath shallow. No, this is not guilt. Kelvin hesitated. Then what is it? Joshua's lips trembled as he whispered, it's justice. A long silence stretched between them. Then Joshua suddenly stood up. His movements were slow, rigid. His eyes seemed to look past Kelvin, as if seeing something he couldn't. Kelvin took a step back. Where are you going? Joshua didn't answer. He walked toward the door. Kelvin grabbed his arm. Joshua, talk to me. Joshua finally turned to him. A chilling smile crept onto his face. She's waiting. And with that, he walked out. Kelvin watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Something was very, very wrong. Joshua wandered aimlessly through the night. The street lights flickered. The air was thick with humidity, pressing against his skin like a suffocating blanket. He could hear her. Not loud, not clear, but she was there. Joshua. His mother's voice slithered through the darkness, curling around him like an invisible noose. He gritted his teeth. Leave me alone. But the whisper didn't stop. Joshua. He walked faster. His steps were unsteady. His vision blurred. The street ahead twisted and warped, as if the world itself was shifting under his feet. Then, up ahead, he saw it. His house, the house where it had happened, the house where he had taken her life. The front door stood slightly open, as if inviting him in. Joshua stopped. His breath came in shallow gasps. He didn't want to go inside, but his feet moved on their own, step by step, until he crossed the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind him. Darkness swallowed him whole. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something rotten. His chest tightened. Then, from the center of the room, a shadow moved. Joshua's breath hitched, and then he saw her. Mrs. Jacinta, sitting on the couch, her lifeless eyes fixed on him. A slow, eerie smile spread across her lips. Joshua's knees buckled. He fell to the ground, trembling. Tears burned his eyes. Please, please, I didn't mean to. Her smile widened. Didn't mean to? Her voice was soft, almost gentle. But you did it anyway. Joshua sobbed. I was desperate. You took my life. A cold gust of air swept through the room. Joshua clutched his head, shaking. Please, I'm sorry. The shadows around her grew darker, deeper. Sorry. Her voice no longer sounded human. It was everywhere. Inside his head. Inside his bones. Joshua screamed. Then the walls began to bleed. Thick, black blood oozed from every surface, dripping onto the floor. The stench was unbearable. Joshua scrambled backward, his heart pounding. Then his mother stood up, slow, and hurried. Her feet didn't touch the floor. Her body glided toward him. Joshua whimpered. She crouched in front of him, tilting her head. Then she whispered, it's time to pay. Joshua's scream ripped through the night. And outside, the wind howled. Joshua sat in the darkness of his small, suffocating apartment, his body curled up on the cold floor. Sweat clung to his skin, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His eyes darted wildly around the dimly lit room, searching for anything that would prove to him that what he had been seeing for years was nothing more than his own mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew. She was here. just like she had been every night since the moment he struck her down. Since he had watched the life drain from her eyes. Since he had wiped her blood off his trembling hands, believing that money could erase the weight of his sins. But there were some things that could never be washed away. A cold breeze swept through the room, though there were no open windows. The light bulb flickered, its dim glow casting shadows that seemed to stretch and move. Then, the whisper came. Joshua. His entire body seized. His pulse pounded so hard it felt like his chest would burst open. His fingers dug into the floor as he clenched his jaw, squeezing his eyes shut. Not again. Not again. Please, not again. But when he opened his eyes, she was standing right in front of him. Mrs. Jacinta. Her face was exactly as it had been the night she died. Her dress was still stained with blood, her once warm eyes hollow and lifeless. But there was something else, something worse. She was smiling. A slow, knowing smile. Joshua whimpered, his back pressing against the wall. Mama, please, he choked out. I'm sorry. I regret it every day, I swear. The smile did not fade. Regret, her voice was soft, almost tender. Did you regret it when you counted the money, when you spent it? Joshua shook his head violently, tears spilling from his eyes. I was a fool. I was blinded by greed. His hands clutched his chest. I can't take this anymore, Mama. Every night, you're here. You won't let me rest. Her head tilted slightly, studying him. And you deserve rest. If I let you be, others will still kill you. It is my fault for pampering you too much, for letting you have whatever you wanted. Joshua let out a broken sob. Please, have mercy on me. Mrs. Jacinta took a slow step forward. The air turned ice cold. Joshua's breath came out in shuddering gasps. You took my life, Joshua, she whispered. Now, it's time to take yours, to save you from public humiliation. Joshua's eyes widened in terror. No, the walls around him seemed to close in, suffocating him. Shadows stretched, reaching for him with unseen hands. His mother's face twisted not in rage, but in something more terrifying. Judgment. Joshua scrambled to his feet. His chest was tight, his breath shallow. His mother did not move, but her voice followed him. Joshua. He spun toward the door, his shaking hands fumbling with the lock. Joshua. He yanked the door open, but instead of the hallway outside he saw his mother standing there. Joshua staggered backward, his body collapsing against the wall. No, he whispered. No, this isn't real. This isn't real. His mother's smile widened. Come, my son. Joshua let out a strangled scream. He turned, his body moving before his mind could process it. His legs carried him toward the only escape he had left, the rope hanging from the ceiling. He didn't think. He couldn't think. His hands moved on their own, tying the knot, looping it around his neck. A voice, his mother's voice, filled the room. Justice has been served. Joshua kicked the stool from beneath him. For the first time in years, the house fell silent. And this time, Mrs. Jacinta never returned. Hello champions, I hope you enjoyed the stories. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for always watching and listening to our stories.